All righty, we've got the recording going, and we're going to get ourselves moving. Thank you so much to Michelle Rossmeyer for helping to coordinate and organize and keep us sane and together with all of these conversations. For those of you who know me, I always need lots of help, so I appreciate it. Also want to thank all of our panelists, as well as to acknowledge our co-founding directors, Kira Hudson Banks, Amber Johnson. Both of them have already completed their community conversations in the previous 2 weeks. If you visit our website, you'll be able to view those recordings there. And as I mentioned before, Professor Rakaya Yerby will be the fourth installment of these community conversations. Michelle, if you want to go to the next slide. We want to acknowledge our partners and funders. The Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity was founded in 2018 as part of our university's Big Idea Project, where the four of us came together to conceptualize what this institute might look like in helping to think about not only healing justice, social justice, but how do we achieve racial and health equity by eliminating systems of oppression that cause health disparities. If you want to go to the next slide, Michelle, thank you. Again, I want to thank the co-founding directors, our program director, Michelle Rossmeyer. You can see our email here, ihje@slu.edu, our Twitter handle, IHJE_SLU. You can also find us on LinkedIn, as well as our website, ihje.org. So what I'll do is I'll introduce our panelists, one by, actually right before they present. We're gonna have Jonathan Johnson first. Jonathan Johnson has been an activist working in anti-racism education for more than 10 years. He is trained with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and has assisted nonprofit organizations in implementing anti-racist practices. He is experienced in leading affinity spaces for Black males on the intersection of race and gender. Additionally, he has designed trainings for survivor advocates on addressing institutional bias in helping professions. He serves as the co-chair for the Anti-Racism Task Force for the Society of Public Health Education. And he currently works in higher education, managing support services for graduate students. He's a licensed mental health counselor and health educator. And from what I hear, he makes a mean lemon meringue pie. So I'm going to turn over the reins to Jonathan Johnson, who is going to kick us off. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Keon. And somehow I think that was a subtle request in there, but
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I love to talk about really anti-racism. And that almost seems like a strange thing, since like in our society, it's like, why do you love to talk about anti-racism? Because to move toward equity, to move toward healing, we have to name what the problem is. And, and I think one of the things that in my time in doing the work, I found diversity, equity, inclusion became a buzzword, and people are comfortable with that. We love to talk DEI. We'll talk diversity, equity, inclusion all day long. You say the word racism and you get very different responses. It's like, whoa, that makes people uncomfortable. And then really, I think what I say is, what is it about that makes people so uncomfortable? Why does the word race bring this up? And part of it is, I think it's really part of our nation's history that we would prefer to pretend didn't happen. And I think diversity, equity, inclusion doesn't require us to do that. I could say equity, I could say inclusion, and I don't have to name the thing that's put us in the situation that we're currently in. And so, what I love, it's Dr. Joy DeGrasse, she says what stands between an African-American man and his liberation is the 400-year history that we have here in the United States. And so if we're not going to talk about that 400-year history, we can't ever move toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so a lot of the work that I do around anti-racism is, how do we understand what is race? What is this construct? Where did this construct come from? And what's created this tension? What's created this division? What's created this, as Barbara Wallace says, the A over B paradigm, whereby someone is in power and that their entire identity is wrapped up in who essentially is beneath them. And so these are the things that we have to start to unpack in the work. So one of the things I have to say is part of the work is how do we identify a catalytic moment? Classic example, in our nation, a year ago, George Floyd, catalytic moment for our nation. Adam Toledo, catalytic moment for us. So as an organization, the first thing you have to do is identify what are those moments that's happening that is forcing people to challenge their paradigm. My previous paradigm saying, I think that racism is a thing of the past. We've moved forward. We're all doing great. We all sit around the table and sing Kumbaya. Maybe there's one or two racist people in the world, but for the most part, we have an equitable system. Then we face this situation. So then it forces people to think, perhaps what I was thinking was incorrect. Perhaps there is an issue more than what I was previously aware of. So as an institution, your first step is to recognize the catalytic moment and use it as an opportunity, because here's the thing about a catalytic moment, it does not last forever. Something's in the news cycle today and then people move on tomorrow. So when there is a moment, how do we lean into that moment and begin to have the conversation that people are starting to think about when they're first starting to question? You know, one of a close mentor and friend of mine, Dr. Brenda Salton McNeil, she identifies what she calls in her roadmap to reconciliation. She says there's a pathway that happens after the catalytic moment. Catalytic moment happens. Your paradigm is challenged. You're recognizing that perhaps the way I see the world is not as well informed as I thought it was. I'm going to go down one of two pathways. I might go to isolation and preservation, where I go, you know what, I want to stay within my realm of thinking. So I'm going to stay with people who think exactly the way I do. I don't want to be challenged. So then I'm going to resist any attempt to move me outside of this paradigm. Or the other pathway that I go down is the pathway of realization. I have to come to realize there's something that I was unaware of. There are some hidden biases that I have. Identification. I begin to connect outside of spaces where I previously started connecting. Preparation. I start moving toward what are the actionable steps that I have to take. It's not enough to sit there and go, oh, I think there might be racism. I think racism affects individual health. I think it's a strong social determinant of health. Then what am I going to do about it? What's my responsibility? And then I move into action. I've made the preparation. I start to take those steps. And then I have to reevaluate, because maybe the action that I took wasn't as effective as I thought it was going to be. And then I go back into that cycle. But this is what we want to really think about in our respective workplaces. What are the catalytic moments that are happening nationally? And what are the catalytic moments that happen within your institution? And sometimes they can be small. Sometimes you may not realize that it's a moment. It's a moment where people are starting to think, where people are starting to have a paradigm shift, where people are starting to question things. When people might say, why is it that I'm noticing a pattern in who's getting tenure and who's not getting tenure? That question comes up. That's a catalytic moment. Why is it that every time there is a call for the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, I'm noticing who's present, who's not present in the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee? I'm noticing the difference between who I'm asking to volunteer for activities versus who's getting paid for activities. These are all catalytic moments. And so as your institution is facing these catalytic moments, I challenge you to lean into them, because everything inside of you is going to say, no, let's just resist. Let's go toward the status quo. Let's pretend like this is not happening. Let's just say that, let's ignore it. Other thing I would say about race conversations, I've been facilitating them for about 10 years. And what I say is, if you are not slightly uncomfortable in the conversation, you're probably doing it wrong. Because racism should not make you comfortable. And so when we're having a conversation about race and equity, oppression, you should feel a slight level of discomfort, and it means that you're being challenged. It means that growth is occurring. And I think that sometimes we, well-intentioned, but we do actually a lot of harm when we work so hard to make it a space where no one feels uncomfortable. That's not doing the work. The work is someone should feel a little uncomfortable. Last, I do a lot of talk around power, privilege, and oppression. And so what I say about power is the giving up power hurts. If it does not hurt, you didn't give up power. So when I was doing a training with survivor advocates and we were talking through what does it look like to give up power in that relationship? Because in the helping relationship, there's a lot of power dynamics that inherently occur. And someone would say, it's like, no, I'm here to help people. You do realize even by virtue of having the role of the helper, there's a power dynamic whereby you're determining that that person essentially can't survive without you. You've put yourself above them. Helpers are notorious for that. We think that, no, I'm doing a great thing. No, but on some level, what you're doing is you're reaffirming the power that you already have. And so when I say, what area of power did you have to give up to create equity? And then if the person goes, oh, well, this is what I did and it felt great. I'm like, you didn't give up power. The minute you tell me it felt great, you probably didn't give up power. When I hear you say, this is what I had to do and this hurt, this was hard, this made me feel uncomfortable, then I know you gave up power. Because we inherently crave power. And so when you're in a position of power and there's someone that is being oppressed, it's difficult because as much of us we don't want to admit it, deep down in somewhere in your core, there's a good feeling in having someone beneath you, because that's inherent to the way our society was built. And so we have to undo that paradigm. We have to actively challenge ourselves to say, no, this is not okay. And so the work of anti-racism is that hard, deep heart conversation, that statement of saying, I have to give up something. I have to push myself to be uncomfortable. And then when you think you finally arrived and I am the champion of anti-racism, you realize that you have to get even a little more uncomfortable than you were before. That's when you know you are actively engaged in the work. And so I was looking at the time. I promised Keon I would stay within my 10 minutes.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. I'll
Great.
wait until you're finished, and I'll pose a couple of follow-up questions.
Sure. Actually, you could pose the follow-up questions now.
Okay. Well, first, thank you so much again for being here. And one of the things that you said at the beginning of your remarks was really challenging this notion of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And many statements were written last year. Many new committees, task forces, whatever, were formed in corporate America, across higher ed, across nonprofits. What is the biggest challenge that you see to DEI and limiting any sort of progress just in a DEI space?
So what's interesting in my experience in DEI spaces, we will talk about everything but race. DEI spaces will talk about gender equity. We'll talk about issues, sexual orientation, and these are all important issues. But it's interesting how race will be the ignored issue in DEI. And so I think because again, there is something about race that hits at such a core area in our, like what I call the dark side of our history, that we would rather not talk about it. And DEI unfortunately creates an easy avenue to do that. Second, DEI doesn't require ownership. Someone does not have to, you don't have to admit that there is a history of oppression to talk about DEI. And DEI also, I find, puts an unfair burden on marginalized populations. Very often the framework of DEI is marginalized population, tell us what the institution needs to do so that to fix itself. And what I say to that is, so you're asking me to fix a problem that I didn't create. And so it's, when what also happens with DEI committees, and I've seen this lots, particularly in higher ed, the faculty member, the minority faculty member that's up for tenure has no time to do their research because they're on every DEI committee trying to inform the institution of how the institution needs to fix itself. Then they don't get tenure. And while the institution is talking to them about what can we do to help you feel more supported? And a lot of some of the responses, I would have felt a lot more supported if I actually had time to do my research to get my tenure, as opposed to being on this committee, informing you, giving you the 400-year race history lesson. And so I would say that that's the the inherent challenge in DEI. DEI creates too much of an easy out for the institution to not take responsibility for the way it's been complicit in issues of racism.
Okay, so I'll continue this just a little bit. You know, one of the challenges that we have had in establishing and launching the Institute is that a lot of people want to sort of pigeonhole us into that DEI space and to be the resource guy, to be the group of trainers, to, you know, or the guest lecturers to, you know, come to a class and talk about that race stuff, or talk about that intersectionality stuff, or talk about that racism stuff. And I agree with your comments, and I also, you know, the ways that we have to change structures within our institutions. So what would be your suggestion for how do we move beyond even just the notion of DEI to moving towards better structures within our institutions? And the second part to that is, how do we connect that to community?
Absolutely. Well, so I think the first thing is we have to use the word race. We have to name racism, and we have to talk anti-racism. Yeah, I think that I'm hearing it more now. I think it has to become more of the norm for us to say that, because racism, that's really us directly addressing this is the problem, and this is the way we're taking ownership in how we've been complicit in the problem. I think that's one of the core steps. We have to go there. It has to be named. We have to say we're going to be the Health Equity Anti-Racism Task Force. We're going to have this task. We're going to talk about racism. We're going to invite a training on undoing racism. This has to be something that we have to be willing to name. And so I think that's the first step, naming it and discussing it, and then creating what I call appropriate. A very big fan of affinity spaces. I think what also happens is sometimes we want to jump to let's all get together and have this wonderful kumbaya discussion. And here's some of the challenges with that. One, that's actually not always the most effective. I think that there are sometimes, particularly when you're talking about oppressed communities, there are things that there's not always the feeling of the freedom to be able to say certain things in certain spaces. And then you have to look at developmental levels. And so if you have someone that's white and maybe is not as aware of certain racial realities, we don't want a situation where it feels that the oppressed community is essentially teaching the community that has oppressed them about why they need to be validated. That's harmful, and that's harmful to the oppressed community. It does not help. It does not help the white community in their own development. So what we do with affinity spaces is you find individuals that already have some of that background, they have the understanding, they have the lens, they've done some of the work. And then you would have a white affinity space where they're talking through and processing some of that, so that when you actually have the conversation cross-racially, it's a productive conversation and no one's being harmed in the conversation. What I say is, I'm okay with discomfort. I'm not okay with there being lack of safety. Wow. And so I would say that's the process and the paradigm that we have to shift. We have to name racism, and we have to be systematic in having this, what I call like the intimate conversations first before we have the larger conversation.
No, that's really important, and it's really helpful in terms of thinking about the role of affinity spaces. And I think this is a good opportunity, a good segue to our next panelist. And we'll come back to some questions about affinity spaces because I think they're important. I think one of the challenges to that is people are afraid to talk about creating spaces for white people to have these very important conversations. So I'm gonna move to our next panelist, who is Nora Jones. And as I pull Nora's bio up, I'm doing all this, so Nora will get ready. I had the privilege and pleasure of meeting Nora as a member of the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative, the partnership project, when I was finishing my doctoral studies and applying for a postdoc program at UNC at Chapel Hill. It was like February of 2008. And I had the wonderful opportunity of meeting Nora and a number of others, Ms. Nettie Code, as part of that project. And I just fell in love with that group. I fell in love with everyone there. That is a personal intro, and now sort of more professional intro. Nora Jones is a native of Richmond, Virginia, and received her undergraduate degree from Virginia State University in Petersburg. She earned a master's degree in secondary education from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and was a middle school and high school French teacher for over 22 years in Petersburg, Richmond, Virginia, and in Greensboro. In 2007, Nora was diagnosed with breast cancer and found it difficult to find a support group which met her needs. So she decided to establish a local affiliate chapter of the Sisters Network, which she's going to talk more about today. Part of that network, Nora helped to charter, she became the founding president. Today, the Sisters Network of Greensboro has over 40 members and is actively involved in promoting breast health awareness through outreach to area churches, the Gift for Life Block Walk, which is a door-to-door neighborhood canvassing project, participating in health fairs, radio talk shows, and other breast cancer events. The Greensboro chapter supports early detection by providing free screening mammograms to women who are uninsured. In addition to that, the Sisters Network, Nora is the former executive director of the Partnership Project, an agency which sponsors anti-racism workshops. She is also a member of the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative, which is the project I mentioned earlier. She was named the community-based principal investigator for a 5-year NIH project on breast and lung cancer with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the Cone Health Cancer Center, and the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Nora has 2 children, Christopher and Sabrina, and 3 grandchildren, Naomi, Evelyn, and Vince. And I can say that Nora makes one of the meanest sweet potato pies I've ever had. You think I forgot about those pies I had in North Carolina? I did not.
Okay.
This is not to instigate a pie competition, but I am here for it if it happens. All right, I'm willing to sacrifice my own hot boy summer for a pie. All right. Okay. Turn it over to Nora.
Well, thank you very much, Keon. And I want to thank you for that lovely introduction. And we do miss you a lot. And I'd like to try, is it Jonathan with the lemon meringue pie, though? You know, that used to be my favorite. Jonathan, I want to tell you how much I appreciate your remarks. You sound like you've been to many REI or Undoing Racism workshops in your past. And I appreciate all of the information you shared. Once again, I used to wear many hats, but most recently, the primary head is with the Sisters Network Greensboro chapter. But Keon is correct in saying I am the former executive director of the Partnership Project. And as such, in Greensboro, we plan those Racial Equity Institute workshops, the Undoing Racism workshops for many, many years. I also am a founding member of the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative in Greensboro. And I was involved in that first research study that we did involving an equal number of African-American women and white women to reveal their breast cancer experience. Out of that research study, Cancer Care and Racial Equity Study in 2005, the white women who participated revealed that there was a lack of support for African-American women going through breast cancer in Greensboro. And I was shocked at that in a way, but then again, when I went to the support group myself as a patient, there were only 2 women of color in the room, and the other lady said nothing, and I had to fight to get in a few comments. Nobody spoke to me, and I didn't feel welcomed at all, and I said, and one lady did say when I was leaving, "Are you coming back?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And that was the end of that. And I kept wondering, what else is there for support out here when you're going through breast cancer? Finally, the American Cancer Society called me and told me that there was a group called Sisters Network. I said, "What are you talking about?" And they gave me the names of women in Charlotte and Durham. And when I called these ladies, I found out that there was a national organization for Black women going through breast cancer called Sisters Network, Inc. It was started in 1995 by a woman named Karen Jackson. And there were chapters all across the United States. I was floored. I didn't know anything about that. So these slides, for a moment here, will give you a little bit of information about what we do. It was very hard to start this chapter because I knew nothing about writing up all of the documentation, justification, and the members of the Greensboro Health Disparities were instrumental in helping me to get that charter for the Greensboro chapter. So you can see from this first slide that we have been in business now for 10 years, breaking the silence and restoring lives. So I am very proud that I have been around that long. I will be going into my 11th year as president. I need to retire, but it has been very rewarding. Next. Okay, and this is our first executive board in 2010. We have only lost one person, in the middle standing. 4 women in total have died. All right. Keon, next. Okay. I'm just running through these briefly. During the years I've been worked as president, we had our First Ladies Brunch. Next. And Keon, you would appreciate this. You see Nettie on the far right, next to me in the pink hat and pink jacket. Nettie died in 2012. And that was the first year, no, it wasn't the first year, but it was the first time that we got an award as the outstanding chapter of the year in Houston. I had to fly back for her funeral because I was on the program. But Nettie was a great inspiration. She came to every activity we hosted with Sisters Network. I don't know how she did it all, but as you can see, she was terminal at that point. All right, next. All right, next, these are just some of the ladies. And this is part of our community outreach. We are invited to speak, to exhibit, to participate in so many activities, and not only Greensboro, but I've been to Charlotte and Raleigh. I've been a lot of different places representing Sisters Network, including the national conferences, which have been held in Houston, Baton Rouge, Detroit, all around. So I am usually very busy. So COVID kind of put a stop to a lot of that, but we are doing a lot of Zoom events. Next. All right, with the health fair, this Pink in the Park. Next. One thing we do is go to a different church every month before COVID. And I am always amazed at the women there at the churches will often come up to me and ask me to examine their breast. And that makes me feel very uncomfortable, because that means they don't have a medical home. They're not getting their regular checkups. So we try to steer them toward a medical home, or what if they need to get Medicaid or whatever it is, so that their medical needs can be taken care of. But this is a big thing. I've been in churches where, I don't know if you can call them churches, where there's one way in and one way out. It's only one room, and one I remember particularly was around Christmas time. Instead of gifts under the tree, there were things like paper towels and toilet paper, toothpaste. This was the type of community. So I saw a lot of things that were really troubling. There's a lot of work to be done. Next. All right, and this is in Charlotte. I received an award for our work there. Next. Okay, these are just some more pictures of our outreach to the community via the churches. A lot of the ministers are pictured in there with us, and we are allowed some speaking time. at the service to talk about what we do and engage the members in inviting them to our events. So I have learned a lot about Greensboro by going to these. We've been to over 60 churches and we haven't covered them all yet. Next. So this is our biggest event, the Gift for Life Block Walk. It started in 2011 at Warnersville Recreation Center. And you can see we tried to stay at one facility for 2 years and move them. So fortunately, we stopped with 2019. Our problem now, the event has gotten so big, we're having a hard time finding a facility that's large enough to accommodate us, because we typically have 100 or more volunteers to assist us with a door-to-door canvas. Next. So this is what Block Walk looks like. These are some of our members here. And you can see in the bottom left, one of the residents has agreed to come to the door to receive her packet, and they take a brief survey. They're asked if they need any help getting a mammogram, and they are also invited to the facility where they can get, everything is free. Clinical breast exam, blood pressure checks, get your eyebrows done, share massages. It's a really big event. We had a lot of trouble in the beginning because a lot of the people thought we were bill collectors and they would not open the door. So we learned that you just can't roll up in those communities. You have to prepare, go to the churches and announce it. And then we had a lot of students who wanted to help, but a lot of them were white, Asian, and that made it more problems for us because they wouldn't open the door for them. So we had some challenges with this, but overall it has been a wonderful attempt to get into the community, talk to the people, and find out how we can assist them in achieving better health. Next. And these are some of the students who work with us. As you can see, there are many of them who come out and they do a fantastic job with assisting us every year. Next. And the upper left-hand corner is our group. At the bottom left would be the volunteers. Okay, next. And here we are, our group again at the top. And that's not all of them, but those who were there that day. And at the bottom, you see the volunteers. Next. Okay, and this is the slides. If you have any questions, please let me know. But this has been Sisters Network Greensboro, and it came out of the partnership project, the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative. They have supported me throughout the entire 10 years we've been together. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing more information about the Sisters Network. I really do appreciate it. I do have a couple of questions for you. You pointed to a couple of things that have helped to support your community engagement. And so what have been some important strategies that you have used engaging Black women in the Greensboro area around breast cancer?
Well, again, we have been to many presentations, church events. Anytime we can get an audience, we accept. It's gotten so busy in October that we have to divide ourselves into teams of maybe 2 or 3 so that we can do like 4 events in one night. Zoom has helped, so we did more this year, probably because of Zoom. We could get around to a lot. But we do have the Gift for Life Block Walk, and we also sponsor a breast cancer symposium so that the doctors can come in and talk to the people about breast cancer, and the women are able to come to the mic and ask any questions. This is like a free medical visit, and so that has worked very well also. And a lot of the Greensboro Health Disparities members assist me with that project as well. So that's the way we reach out to them, but it's always about learning. A lot of women don't know how to advocate for themselves. I get a lot of calls saying the doctor won't touch me, and they don't know what to do, but they don't want to, Jonathan, they don't want to call it racism. They don't have a name for it, but they know it doesn't make them feel good. And the doctor won't look in my eyes. He won't call me by my name. These are all things that they report to me that make them feel disrespected. And not only that, once they get the feeling that they're being dismissed, disrespected, or disbelieved, then they want to stop treatment. So then you got to get them to look at the bigger picture, talk to people, talk to your nurse navigator about what you're feeling, what you're going through, who has offended you. You remember, Keon, this was called critical incidents. And there are a lot of critical incidents that go on in a hospital setting. One lady recently told me that when she comes for her chemo treatment, they're always talking about who's getting off. What time do you get off? Who's coming on shift now? And that makes her very nervous, but she hasn't told anybody. So the first thing you need to do is express that, speak it. This doesn't make me feel good. The last time you almost missed giving me my shot after my chemo because they're so busy wanting to get off. So these are some of the things we do. We try to assist women with the self-advocacy piece.
That's a great transition to talking a little bit about the connection between the Sisters Network and the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative, where you all have been actively involved in bridging community to thinking about anti-racism within the Cone Cancer Center, documenting the problems and actually developing some solutions to addressing some of the quality of care and equity in care. If you could maybe talk about some of the work and the projects that you all have been involved in.
Well, I think you probably are familiar with the Cure study. They were talking about that yesterday on another call. This was a massive research study involving patient interviews. I think it was every 2 to 3 months. They had a special nurse navigator to oversee the care of the patients. We had a physician champion to try to get the doctors involved and get them to take REI training so that they themselves would be able to understand what racism looks like to a lot of women, why there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear and distrust. Otherwise, why would women be coming up to me? I tell them I'm not a doctor. They said, that's okay, just examine my breast. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. You need a doctor. But there's a great fear and distrust. So the Q study found out that if they put all these elements together, you have the real-time registry. So if a patient doesn't show up for an appointment, then there's a red flag and the doctor's notified and then the patient is called to come back in. So at the end of the study, to make a long story short, completion for care improved for both white patients and Black patients. And that was phenomenal. That never happened before. Just putting all of that in place, keeping it going. But we also had some challenges with that because every time you get a new person on the team, you almost have to start over. So with Cone Health, we wanted to do an Accure 2 study, but the new CEO would not have it. I mean, he didn't want to participate, so that fell through. So I found that to be true. Every time a new person comes on, you have to establish a relationship all over again. And that's the story of life, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But small steps.
Yeah, so definitely seems like, not only there is this sort of iterative process of the ways that you've been engaging community in Greensboro, trying to reach various populations where Black women are, but also in your work in helping to develop some research projects, also recognizing that how you engage folks within the healthcare system becomes critically important in terms of how do you think about addressing issues related to inequities of care. just one quick question. What made you all decide to do anti-racism training? Because it started with a group that Jonathan worked with the People's Institute. You guys did a lot of anti-racism trainings. So what made you all decide to do that?
That was before my time. When I came on, Nettie Cole said, you got to take this training. She was coming to my house almost every week. And my husband, I found, said, let's go do the training so she'll stop coming by the house. So we went there, and Ron Chisholm was there, and another person, a Black male, and they were phenomenal at Guilford College. But Nettie had already been to New Orleans and had the training under Ron Chisholm. And she said, we got to have this in Greensboro. So she was the one that pushed forward, and she got it started with the partnership project. And I wish Nettie could see it now, because I remember the first white church we tried to engage in hosting the workshop. The minister gave us an appointment time, but we showed up and he didn't show up. We sat there, and Nettie didn't want to leave. I said, Nettie, I don't think he's going to come. And finally, the cleaning lady said, he's not coming back. You can leave. And I thought about that. Do you know today, almost every white church in Greensboro wants to host a workshop. Some of them are doing it 2 or 3 times per year. Wow. It is just amazing how everything has taken off now. Everybody wants to learn about racism and what they can do. We have the White Caucus. The white people meet and they decide what they're going to do about racism. They write a lot of letters to the newspaper and things like that. There's the Black People of Color Caucus, and then they come together to have a meeting. So there are a lot of things going on in Greensboro. It is really at the forefront of every race. You can't get away from it. It's at the forefront of everything we do. So it is something we really need to pay attention to. And most recently, it's been highlighted by COVID and how many Black people are dying. And on 60 Minutes, about the effect of racism on the health of people of color. So you can't ignore it.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Don't go away. I'm going to.
Okay.
We got 2 more folks. I'm going to bring Bryan Capers into the conversation next. Bryan Capers is a first-generation college graduate. He's been committed his professional work to helping foster opportunities for young people and communities related to educational access and advocacy. Bryan was born and raised in the Bronx, New York, earned his bachelor's in sociology from Hampton University, the home by the sea. After graduating from Hampton, Bryan joined an education-focused service program called City Year, completing over 1,700 hours of service in at-risk communities and schools in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. Following his City Year commitment, Bryan earned a master's degree in social work from the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, with a focus on urban education and youth development. After graduation, Bryan found a St. Louis home in Wyman Center, a youth development agency focused on educational success, college access, persistence, and social emotional learning. At Wyman, Bryan served in a variety of roles, leading post-secondary access and persistence roles from 2012 to 2017, before engaging in a short stint in higher ed at the University of Kansas and Avila University. Bryan was selected as a 2016 Emerging Leader with Focus St. Louis, as well as recognized as one of the 30 under 30 by the St. Louis Business Journal, in acknowledgement of his work in the field of college access and persistence. In January of 2019, Bryan returned to St. Louis to work for the Wyman Center to help develop a new initiative called the Wyman Leaders, where he currently serves as the director. And on a personal note, Bryan is a phenomenal karaoke singer. Not only in karaoke spaces, he can sing outside of karaoke spaces. I've had the privilege and pleasure of hearing him belt out a few tunes. And so with that, I will turn the mic over to Bryan. Thank you so much.
Oh goodness, you're too much. I'm excited. I'm energized. I'm also inspired by both of the presenters prior to me, Jonathan and Nora. I have a lot of just running thoughts. I was like, oh my gosh, like my whole order is just kind of messed up. Just especially thinking about like the work around anti-racism and what that journey has been for my agency. It's almost as if like we just arrived, but Mike Brown got murdered in 2014, right? That was what, 7 years ago? And we're in St. Louis and we serve the Ferguson community, right? So what does that look like? And I'm gonna get to that in a minute, but that's kind of what was percolating in my mind this whole time that I was just sitting here, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is exactly it. This is the burdensome piece that I've been feeling. So wanted to thank you for sharing that perspective, Jonathan, and inspiring me, Nora. So I'm going to share my screen a little bit just to kind of walk you through some of the initiatives at the Wyman Center. Make sure I'm doing it right. Cool beans. So the Wyman Center has been around since 1898, right? And has worn a number of hats, right? So some people know us as Camp Wyman, where young people come out to just basically to camp and have some free meals and enjoy time and then go right back home. And that was the initial kind of goal of what the Wyman Center represented early on. Later down the line, we started developing more intensive programs specific to high school graduation, amongst other things. We do a lot of training. We do a lot, just to put it in a nutshell, right? So what I tried to do was put our framework into 3 buckets, right? So we serve adults, and the way in which we do that is through training, both locally and nationally with the evidence-based programming. We also do trauma training, amongst other positive youth development trainings. We also have a focus on young people. So when we think about working with young people in their communities, strong focus on social emotional learning, relationship building, and ensuring that they have the tools and resources they need to be successful. And the last bucket that Wyman operates out of is systems, right? So we work with systems and collaborate to ensure that the resource bank that's propelling that community is successful. So how do we bridge the gap? What can we do on our end to work within communities and collaborate within school systems? All right, so that's our agency at just much higher level. But when we think about, again, I talked about the anti-racism work, right? That kind of leads into my program, right? So my program is called the Wyman Leaders Program. And we serve young people in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. We recruit primarily low-income students and first-generation students. The majority of the students across the districts in St. Louis City and St. Louis County have a high number of African-American students. So you would imagine that the population of our young people are primarily African-American. We have at least, at a minimum, about 70% of our students identify as African-American. Right, so our program is designed to be a year-round program. We recruit them before the summer of their 9th grade year, and then we work with them all the way through whatever their post-secondary path is. So whether that's military, whether that's 2-year, 4-year, certificate programs, trade, it doesn't matter to us, right? What matters is a young person that has a goal, that has a belief that they can achieve. So we want to make sure that we can support them in whatever that looks like, right? One of the things that I think makes us a little bit unique when you think about a lot of other programs that do this type of work is our foundation that we set forth within our summer programming. So the first year of our program, we have young people come out to our Eureka campus where they're leaving their technology, no phones, no video games, we call it like contraband, so you can't bring any snacks from home, nothing that's going to deter you or distract you from building community and developing relationships, not just with your peers, but also with the adults, right? So can you imagine, and me as a staff member, I was from New York, so I was like, oh my gosh, like my first summer out here, I'm in the woods. Like, do we do this, right? So we have young people coming out to the woods for the first time, and they're in cabins. They have to develop values and appreciate the values that other people are bringing to the table. They have to develop respect, right? They're learning about each other. It doesn't matter if you're introvert or it doesn't matter if you're extroverted, right? What matters is how do we do this thing together, right? So they're going through activities like zip lining, climbing wall, and I have some photos just to kind of like demonstrate that. Zip lining, climbing wall, they're doing target sports. They do trust falls, right? They have to figure out how to best support each other, and they might be mad and tired, during the duration of the 21 days, but at the end of that, they don't want to go home, right? Because they've seen the value in the relationships that they've built. And, that's one of the pieces that when we look at students at the end of the program, they oftentimes reference like the hikes that they've done or the community service that they've done, right? They'll talk about the civil rights trip that they'll do that the second year in the program. They might talk about and reference the college tour, but it always comes back down to, man, when we were at camp and when we had to challenge ourselves to go up the climbing wall, and I just got up the ladder just a little bit, I appreciate you giving me the push to just go up to the next rock. And for young people, that's important to be able to build a foundation within their peers, because when we think of retention, right, it's not, I don't want to say like it's not adults, right? We need trusting adults to support the development of young people. But when you have a strong cohort of young people that can bring themselves forward and exemplify and model for themselves what leadership looks like, and then they define success, that's how we know we won, right? And so as I talk through the program, I mentioned like the first couple of years, they come out to our campus, we do a post-secondary tour where we give them access and exposure to 4-year, 2-year career, trade. We take them out of state. We allow them to observe HBCUs, all of that, right? Because we want them to make an informed decision pretty early on, so that way we can help them to develop pathways and give them as much exposure as possible. We've also learned in our model that near peers, so students who have just recently graduated from our program, to serve as just counselors or come back on panels is extremely helpful. One in which it gives young people a sense of purpose of giving back to their community. And then 2, it also employs them. So we do pay them to come back and serve as, camp counselors, and they enjoy that and they look forward to it. So not only do we hit the milestone of, yes, you're going to graduate, right? Because we want you to graduate from high school. But beyond that, their impact is beyond themselves, right? So they're thinking beyond themselves. And it would be important for me to know that, one, this is what we want to see, right? We want young people to be harmonious like this, but it takes so much time and so much work and so much energy to get them to understand that their voices are extremely important. And then they're loud, right? They have permission to be their full selves. Oftentimes, and I can say even as an adult working in my agency, right? I have to figure out like, how do I become my full self? How can I be vulnerable enough to not lose my cool when I'm challenged, right? But also to be forthright in what I'm saying about my experience at my agency, serving my young people, serving the communities that that we're looking to impact, right? So I wanted to share, some of just what our outcomes are pretty much annually. So cross fingers, will still be at 100% high school graduation this year, but the pandemic has thrown so many curveballs to how we engage young people and our community partners in doing this work collectively. And that's one of the other things that I think is pretty unique to our agency, in that we don't do the work in like by ourselves, right? So we're working with some of we look at it like collective impact, right? I know that's another buzzword, another buzz term, right? But it is true, right? So we work with the Scholarship Foundation around financial literacy, and the League of Student Advocates that go down to Jefferson City and advocate for pieces like Bright Flight, right? So we want Missouri Access. We want need-based aid. We don't really care about that Bright Flight because we want our young people that truly need the money to be able to go to, post-secondary. Students that already have, the ACTs, they're already going to get that funding. How do we reallocate that, right? So helping young people, and these are young people driving these conversations, right? Adults are getting young people to the table where they're talking to Congress folk about the issues that affect them. So again, just the attention to elevating the voices of young people, but also staying true to mission. Another example of just like collective impact and not doing the work alone is, I can just talk about our partnership with like Missouri State University, which has spanned over 10 years. And I think about like just students who have gone on scholarship for Missouri State. It's about 80 students that we've had total. Students are graduating, our students are graduating in 4.5 years compared to when you think about nationally and statewide, it's 6+ years with the same parameters or population served, right? So we look at that as a measure of success in how do we build those kind of partnerships across the board, not just at institutions, but community-based organizations, right? Which leads me to my next point around one, just the pandemic changing the work, how we do our work, right? Our work has been wonderful when we could do it in person, right? Because the 21-day sessions, that's key to developing those relationships. Without that, how do we redefine the way in which we navigate the various systems, the school districts that are doing 1,000,001 things. So we're keeping up with that. But then beyond that, redefining like, okay, training, right? Social media is huge for young people. Our staff well equipped for that, right? We think about even within our organizational makeup and representation, right? I can talk explicitly about me being one of 2 Black men at the agency. I hired the second Black man, right? I think about the fact that my executive leadership team is all white women and 1 white man. The next level of leadership is 3 Black women, right? So, and then across the board, the staffing, it varies. So I think about some of the challenges that we have in the work that we do, especially when we think about our commitment to anti-racism. Jonathan, you made a point that it just stuck with me. You have to give up something. You have to give up something, right? So for me, I'm like, well, we already know that our leadership does not reflect the students that we serve. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen because that was all that I was going to share in terms of slides. But leadership doesn't reflect the population that we serve. So what does that look like in terms of our commitment to anti-racism work, right? It's just so complex. It doesn't need to be complex, right? There's a lot of things that you can do to be able to not just elevate the voices of young people, but to also empower staff to work within the community. And I'll also say explicitly, like I'm excited that I had a great relationship with our current CEO, who was the chief of staff at the time. I had a conversation with her around just the killing of Michael Brown and how I felt powerless at my agency that's serving young people in the communities which we serve, and we're not doing anything. What does that tell me about my value here at this agency, right? And thankfully that conversation did strike a nerve in that it led to the DEI Council, right? So we got a consultant and we talked about things a little bit more, but that was what, in 2015? We had a DEI Council. 6 years later, now we're an anti-racism organization. So what happened in that time frame? What were we committing to, right? So I'm excited that we're an anti-racism organization, but what truly does that mean for the work that we do? Because I think we do exceptional work, but how can we be a little bit more impactful? How can we truly be representative in what we say we do? So My brain is going like everywhere. So I'm going to stop because I'm really passionate about one, just changing or assisting with the trajectories of young people and providing them the opportunities that they need to be successful and doing it with them and not for them. But I'm also equally passionate about what are we doing right by people, period. How do we get to that point? Because once we do right by people, then young people gonna get what they need to get.
Mm-hmm. Let me just jump in here because I know Jonathan needs to get to another appointment, but this does sort of squarely fit within some of the comments Jonathan made, and also is reflective of another comment Jonathan made in terms of these catalytic moments, or even as Malcolm Gladwell called them, tipping points. And in terms of there's these events, there's some movement in progress, and then sort of this, this dip downward. Any sort of final thoughts or comments, Jonathan, before you have to head off?
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. No, I think that's spot on. I think it's like exactly what you said. It's like those, just being aware of the events, the moments, and and Bryan, I love what you're doing, and I like even the way you're thinking about it and what you're saying. Like, okay, hey, like what, thinking deeply, like beyond the just, okay, we're creating this council. Are we getting? I always say, are we getting to that hard work? I think that's at the core. Like at the, it's a quote that's the same woman I mentioned, Dr. McNeil. She says, that there's a difference between working hard to not look racist and working hard to create equity and not be racist. And I think, and then it's really, and so I love, like, that's our challenge, I think, in the work.
Well, we're so sorry that you'll have to leave us, Jonathan, but thank you so much for your contributions. And I'll be following up with you later. So,
absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and transition to Marsheda, so that we can get her presentation, and then we'll come back for additional questions and answers and discussion. So Marsheda Ewulomi joined BPI in 2018 as a Polikoff-Gautreaux Fellow and has since remained at BPI as staff counsel, focused on justice reform and police accountability. She specializes in supporting grassroots coalition work and providing creative policy and strategic support to various community and institutional stakeholders. She also owns her own consulting company, Sheverse LLC, which focuses on supporting women and girls in identifying who they are, pursuing their purpose, and owning the power that comes from doing so in the form of public speaking engagements, workshops, seminars, and life coaching. Marsheda received a JD cum laude from Northwestern University, Pritzker School of Law in 2018. During law school, she worked with the MacArthur Justice Center, the Lawndale Christian Legal Center, and the ACLU of Michigan, and also served as vice president of events for the Black Law Students Association. Before law school, she taught 7th and 10th grade English in Washington, D.C. as a Teach for America Corps member. Marsheda is from Lansing, Michigan, and graduated with distinction from the University of Michigan in 2012 with the BA in English and African American Studies. And I also learned today that she is a fan of Korean dramas and anime. So welcome, Marsheda.
Welcome. Thank you so much for that intro, and thank you so much for allowing me to be on this panel. I'm like really honored because I was like, wait, why'd y'all choose me? All of y'all went, what do I have to say? But I'll just dive right in. So again, my name is Marsheda Ewulomi. I am staff counsel at BPI Chicago, the Law and Policy Center, where we touch on a number of areas. And like Keon said, I focus on police accountability and justice reform. And so specifically systems transformation work, which is part of the reason why I ended up leaving the classroom. Like I loved working with my babies, but I got tired of seeing the same issues over and over again. I work primarily with community organizers, community leaders, policy advocates, government stakeholders, and professors in the higher education and prison space. And so a lot of these professors are professors turned advocates that I hope by the end of this call, like we'll all begin to see ourselves as advocates and our role in the advocacy space. So what Keon shared, what I just shared, that's my resume spiel. And I lead with that because I'm expected to. It helps give credibility when I'm in these different spaces, and tells you some key traits about how I work and move in the change. But in my mind, it's not what matters most. What matters most is that I am a walking African diaspora. My dad is Nigerian, my son is Sudanese, and my biological mother is American Black, African American. I'm also the oldest of 4, and I also helped raise 3 of my younger cousins. So why am I sharing this? Because it informs the way that I move. It informs the way that I think. I am used to strategically dealing with the nuance of voice as a Black woman who has both East and West African as well as American cultural roots going in different places. How I exert my agency has to change, but also gives me an appreciation for how, when we are in different spaces, with whether you are a youth advocate, whether you are an older woman, like, how do you have to move? You have to present yourself in order for you to be heard and be able to connect to a collective and have power. And I think a lot of times we share what's the resume and we stop there. But if we are to get beyond thinking of equity or community as just as buzzwords that we care about, and get to this actual healing and seeing equity in process and community for real, then we have to be thinking about norms do we tend to uplift, and what are those norms? And I say this because a number of our norms, like leading with our resume, trying to be distant from these issues, and we're supposed to look at it objectively, that's very rooted in Western civilization and culture and ideology, which is very steeped in white supremacy and colonization. Now, we can't say we want equity and just focus on the outcomes and not think about process. Like, when I work with my, when I'm working with my community partners, one of the things that is consistently raised is the importance of equity being built into the DNA, like, of process. Like, process is built into equity's DNA. If there is not equity in process and how we do the things that we do and how we reach for the outcomes that we're reaching for, then we are more than likely enacting more harm, and we're not advancing a solution. And thinking about these frameworks, this is, it's important that we think about reflection, right? And so, like, we often try to think about going to a training or doing these things, but it's, what am I bringing to the table? It starts with me first so that I can model it, question myself in the process, so then I have real credibility in being able to question systems, and also ensure that I am not perpetuating a system. Like, as a Black lawyer, a Black advocate, I am still participating in the system because I still went and got all of the credentials. I am still advancing a legal system. I am a sworn officer of the court. I have officer in my title. I don't believe in officers. I have officer in my title, right? And we know our court system has not been equitable. And so because we have to participate in the world and we can't completely, separate ourselves from it, we do have to become very, very intentional about those processes that we're uplifting and those norms. I feel like I'm all over the place. Sorry, because I had like a little outline and then y'all started talking and I was like, oh, I'm so inspired. But the other reason that, we need to think and reflect about our I, because I think in academic spaces, we're not supposed to say I. And you guys hear me? It says my connection is low. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Is because I want us to move from community engagement or community development to community partnership. And the reason why I say that is, and this probably comes from, my cultural upbringing, but then also being the oldest of four. When I see you as my other me, regardless of what you look like, but I see you as a part of me, then we all getting across the finish line. And that means that you have become a part of my village. And I think if we are to truly advance equity and to truly make sure to a space where we are healing and advancing healing, we have to get to a space where we are seeing each other as our other me. You are a part of the village. There is no plan B. There is no plan C. We're coming up with a solution. And engagement can be a starts there, right? Supporting in what it looks like to build capacity within community, right? Like if you've never been taught to advocate for yourself and you don't know how to advocate in these spaces, we do have to think about what does it look like to support and building capacity, right? But how do we get to the point of its true partnership where I am giving up some form of power, but also recognizing the different roles that I play. So I think that those are the two main things that I definitely wanted to communicate. And this, I'm sharing it in this way because the lens that I utilize, especially because I get to be in these different rooms as we begin to have different relationships to power, we have to be constantly evaluating the lenses that we use. What are the frameworks that we're operating with? What are my biases? What are my triggers? What are my blind spots? Who do I need to partner with to make sure that my weaknesses are covered and that we are getting to a collective solution? So as I said, I work a lot with a number of community and grassroots coalitions. And in terms of thinking about the work that BPI does, internally, my roles differ from internal versus external. While I'm in BPI, I'm one of three Black people on staff. We're predominantly white staff. And so I am typically the agitator. I don't tell me you want me to be on a recruitment panel and talk about how great BPI is. Only thing I have is my name, and I'm not about to put stand on my name for no white people. I'm just not doing it. So what are we going to do internally so we can begin to live up to this? I know we're all in process, but what are we going to do internally? What are the solutions? If we can't point to a process and a way of how we make sure we are consistently evaluating whether we're anti-racist, we don't get to brand ourselves as anti-racist. If we can't point to it, if I can't see where it is in our questioning and our decision-making, then it's not there. We're not doing buzzwords no more. Right. So there's that one piece. But when I get out of the room, when I am, in these different spaces, I have to recognize that because I have Esquire behind my name, that when I speak up, even as a Black woman, my voice could be silencing to other community members, other partners that do not necessarily have the same type of credentials with the same type of respect that is given to it. Not saying that it's deserved, but the same type of respect that's given to it. So in that sense, I'm more of a listener. I am more of someone who's asking questions as I've helped identify what is key interests of a coalition, what our key interests are, but then making sure that I'm giving information that allows them to make decisions that they can, right? And so it's a lot of thinking about what role do I play? How do I need to shift? But going towards these true definitions of recognizing that it's in the process. So, and this is especially when we're in an organization and like organizers tend to just, everything is via text. We have different marches that are happening, there's so many different pieces. Although I would love to communicate via email, right? That is something that makes a lot of sense. If I truly care about hearing my partner's voice, I'm going to be in a stick. I'm going to be texting. I'm going to be on the phone. I'm going to have to meet people where they are. So I think overall, us evaluating what norms we uplift, how do we make sure we continue to bring our eye to the space? Because at this point, I'm manifesting me. You can get navy, you can get black braids, you can get red ones, you can get blonde ones. I graduated with blue ones. I've had fuchsia. You're gonna get these nails, you're gonna get all these pieces because I'm here. I'm not, because I think we're also conditioned to not have our eye to make other people feel comfortable, and being able to model that and how we exist in these spaces, especially as people of culture, helps us advance an anti-racist agenda. We still need to specifically be structurally talking about it, but also coming up with structural next steps and a timeline for enacting them. Because if somebody tells me to have another discussion without no next steps, we gonna fight. We're not gonna fight because I gotta stay barred, but I'm gonna think about it. So I mean, if there's more specific questions on like the actual work that I do, then great. But I'm gonna just close it there.
No, this has been great. You know, what I've heard, you know, consistently through, you know, each discussion and each presentation is, you know, one about you being your authentic self in the work that you're doing, in the ways that you try to engage communities. And actually, I think it's sort of a good segue to one of the questions I received in terms of thinking about how do you build these types of processes and structures in the work that you do. You're recognizing and acknowledging who you are. How do you help facilitate that with others that you're working with, in particular in the communities that you're engaging and building coalitions with?
I think that's a great question, and it's an ongoing question. And so part of it is being in conversation with not just organizers, but the leaders that they help train up, and being in the spaces, being the fly on the wall, asking the questions, know the more that you can be in conversation with people and just document what they're raising, and not even when you just ask what is the problem, because sometimes we ask questions, but we're not listening around the answer, right? There was her name is Monica Cosby. She's an activist, a very prominent activist in Chicago. She's currently at the Women's Justice Institute. She's also a formerly incarcerated scholar. And when she was talking about one of her challenges as she was re-entering, I was expecting housing, and mind you, a lot of the typical things that come up, whether it be housing, employment, all of those things were important. But the example that she started with was going to the restroom and having difficulty because she had been in for 20 plus years, trying to wash her hands. And that felt like it was going to be the last straw. Part of it was she went in and the world was one way, and coming out and knowing that you have to put your hands under the faucet is another thing. And I'm using this example because there are things that we may assume and how we ask the question. So we'll ask a specific question about housing, but if we're not having the conversation open enough, a story about, I'm very overwhelmed with how the world has changed and how I transition into that change. So even just her example of a faucet wasn't about the faucet. It was about the cultural shift. And so how are we listening, and how are we framing our questions such that they're open enough? And then as you become more comfortable with people and the people that you work with, you'll be able to identify issues that they would more than likely identify, and you can still ask questions in that area.
Great.
Did I answer it?
Yeah, no, it does. And what you're really talking about is helping to restore the dignity, or as my colleagues say, humanizing equity. And that's sort of part of it is recognizing, remembering and reminding people of the dignity of us as just human beings and how we function and have to even sort of re-engage in certain spaces and contexts when we've been out of them or out of touch from them in a lot of different ways. And that speaks to the ways that we try to reach various communities, in particular communities that we are part of, but also distanced from. Because one of the things that you talked about is, as we all have sort of decided to either join this group or gain this credential or this degree, people start to see us as separate from them. But in fact, it does separate us in some kind of ways. But what we have to do is to remind ourselves of our own dignity and the dignity of those that we are trying to connect to. There's a couple of questions that I've received, and one of them, and I'm going to pose this to Bryan first, and he'll know why. What if your organization says they stand for equity, but internally you know that they don't? What if certain leaders of your organization don't align with the principles of equity that they are espousing?
That's a great question, and very honest, right? I think I was a little bit outspoken as well about just my experience and my identity as a Black male under leadership that does not reflect me. And that's just the immediate leadership. We're not even talking about at the board level, right? So if you imagine that at the senior executive and level, there's no one that is remotely close to what resembles me, right? At the other level, it makes it even more difficult, right? Because who's driving decision making, right? How do I get to a point where I'm not afraid to lose my job because I want to speak explicitly about my experience? So for me, and I would encourage anybody to do this, speak up. I'm also a huge proponent of, if something is not right for you, don't be there, right? Know when it's time for you to go, right? So if you've existed within this organization and you know that they're not going to change and they're not going to move the needle forward, and you've done your due diligence in ensuring that, hey, here's my experience here. Here's how I think we can be impactful in shifting the paradigm or shifting the culture of our organization. And here's some solutions that I can also offer in support of us moving forward. If you haven't done that, and we're just talking about like you just dissatisfied, then I'm gonna be like, well, why didn't you say something, right? So I'm gonna always tell you to advocate and speak about your specific experience, because that's something that you can own. And you can give candid examples of what that looked like and felt like for you.
Great. I'm gonna work my way back around, and Nora, I'm actually gonna pose a similar question to you, because one of the things that you talked about with working with the Moses Cone Cancer Center is that you had a period of time where the CEO was engaged in wanting to work with you all and doing some of this anti-racism work, and now you're in a period where you cannot. So maybe if you can help us to think about, well, what allowed you to get some buy-in from the previous CEO, and sort of where's the rub, where's the challenge with the current one? Because one of the things that I recall about the work that you all were doing is that, like many healthcare centers, they're predominantly white, but also a number of physicians were either maybe first generation Americans, recent migrants to the US, and they were unfamiliar with many of the demographics of the Greensboro area.
Well, there are a lot of things going on. First of all, the CEO I was talking about, or the director of the cancer center, that one has since left.
Mm-hmm.
So now what we have now is a person who is a member of the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative. He does understand our mission and our work. but Cone Health has been sold. It's been taken over by another entity. So, that's the problem. The players keep changing, and then you got to keep adapting to the change and kind of buying into what they want, what their expectations are. So to me, that's the challenge, just keeping the relationship going. So we continue to reach out to them. Cone has been good about sending their physicians to the workshop. One doctor, the one I had as my oncologist, I thought he would never go, but he finally broke down and took the full 2-day workshop. So we are making steps, but sometimes you take 2 steps forward and 1 back every time, because like I said, it's always a turnover, and you have to keep adjusting to that change. Mhm.
Thank you. Marsheda, I'm going to come to you, because part of what, we're hearing, and part of what, many of us work for institutions, organizations, or places that are predominantly white. And as Nora mentioned, the system sort of remains the same, and we just interchange players. And that presents some challenges to actually changing the systems and the structures. And so how have you tried to push for change, for institutional change, not only in your employment space, but also the fact that you work in criminal justice reform as well?
It's a great question. I'll answer internally, and then I'll end with externally. So like I said, with organization, part of it is because we are small, tight, and mighty, right? So it's a lot easier to effectuate change. I said easier. I didn't say it was easy at all. And so I literally just got off of a phone call before this phone call with my executive director, and can talk directly to her and can talk directly to my leadership. Also, again, what Bryan said, you can't just raise issues, you have to be coming up with solutions and suggestions. And then my other piece is I need a timeline. We can say that we have these steps, but what is our timeline and our action plan? Because then we have a way of evaluating, did we get here or did we not? And why did we not? I don't care about you feeling guilty and your feelings, don't care about it. I know that sounds really cutthroat, but it's what happens in my brain. So in terms of externally, though, I think the issue that Nora raises, where players are consistently changing, and in order to do the work, it's still extremely relationship based. It's a challenge that we face on a regular basis. Chicago is unique in that there are definitely a number of people that I'm having to speak to that are definitely white and don't look like me who are in these positions of power, but a lot more of the advocates and people who are on the other side of the negotiating table do look like me, and they do have some of the experience. That doesn't mean that, all skin folk ain't kin folk. So not saying that, but let's just be honest. I think it's a constant challenge. I think part of how we think about it is when you're attacking a particular issue, it is not strategically advantageous to only attack it from one angle. So how are we making sure that there are multiple buckets so that if this particular thing falls apart, we still have something else? And I think especially within the policy world, narrative is so important. How an issue is framed is so important. And how are we making sure that that's being advanced? And we're doing both an inside game where we are talking and working with government stakeholders, and an outside game where we are working, and court organizers are leading this, but are working with organizers to agitate and to push. So there has to be a combination of the two, but it's a constant struggle. And I think it's just going to be our struggle for the time, because relationship matters. And then also being strategic about getting the bad people out that we don't like and getting the ones that we do like in place. But you ain't here for me.
That makes it official with the mouth pop. Absolutely. Absolutely makes it official. I'm going to throw out my last question before I give you all an opportunity for any final comments. And it's related to part of the process that Marsheda laid out in terms of thinking about not only framing the issue, but also developing a structure or process that, and this relates to one of the questions that I received about accountability. And how do we hold our organizations or the entities we are trying to push for change? How do we hold them accountable? And if I even remember, Nora, the A in the Accure project, was that accountability? And so I'll start with you and go around.
Well, that is a difficult question, but the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative does try to hold. We've had multiple discussions on the hospital using our work, and they get the accolades, they get the awards, and they rarely mention the small community group that really made it all happen. So you got to keep on trying to keep their feet to the fire and not letting them get away with it. So we call them in when this happens. I know a few years back, they got a big award, and talking about the Accure study and things like that. They did not mention the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative. And a lot of people were offended because we worked very hard for that research study and to get the outcomes that were achieved. So you still have to call them in, call them out, and say, this isn't working. We want to be acknowledged. We're tired of the community being pushed to the side. The same thing with the money part. There was a time when UNC was cooperating with us as subcontractors to give us some money in advance. All of a sudden they said, no, you got to do reimbursement. We were bleeding money. We are a small nonprofit. We could not afford to do that. So we had to go back to the negotiating table. And in fact, there's a big mistrust of community groups. So they didn't want to do that, but they finally acquiesced and we were able to get it done. But and they have asked me to do so many talks on community, working with grants and how do you embrace the community partner and make them feel like they are a part of the solution. You know, it's an ongoing problem, but really every time it happens, you got to call them out and say, this is not acceptable.
Thank you, Nora. I'll go Bryan and then back to Marsheda.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to answer it in 3 parts. I want to start with just like accountability within our board. So I do know that at the board level, we've now recruited 2 program alumni. So perspectives that have never been on the board, I think is incredibly important. And beyond just even those alumni being on the board, I can speak specific to a committee that directly influences my work, the scholarship committee. And selecting young people for our institutional partnership scholarships. So if you have people on that committee that, again, may not understand in fullness or even within context, what our young people are dealing with and what they bring to the table and judging them accordingly, right? So shaking up that committee to make sure that it's reflective of the young people that are going up to scholarships, and there's no disparity or biases that we have to compete with within the selection of those students. So that's just an example of what that looks like at the board level. I'm gonna skip down to where our young people are and the development of there being like a teen council that helps to support decisions in coordination with the board. That's something that's an initiative for 2021. So I'm really, really excited about that because that should have happened a long time ago. It's happening, so there's progress. But at the staff level, I think that's where it gets tricky, right? So you think about like even when decisions are made, oftentimes staff are not brought into the decision-making process until a decision has been made. And then they say, so give me your input on X, Y, and Z, but the decision is made. So why are we doing this? right? So are we including staff in the decision-making process and starting from scratch? And are we saying, here is the decision, I'm going to allow you to say that this is exactly what we're going to do. We already made that decision though, right? So I think that there's a fine line in how we look at equity within our work as it ties to our mission. I think we do amazing work, but when it comes down to decision making and ensuring that all parties and all perspectives are represented, I'm not sure if we're at that place. I think that hopefully part of the anti-racism work that we're doing now will be a lot more reflective than it has been in the past at our agency, and be more reflective of the experiences that oftentimes go missed.
Thank you. Marsheda?
I don't have that much more to add because the points were covered. This is the beauty of going at the end. All the great things were said already. But I think I'll just continue with this internal versus external. I think internally, orgs that do great work kind of suck at equity internally. They might get it better externally. That doesn't mean that they're doing it the best, but they might get it better externally, but the reflection of what happens internally is not that great. From a BPI perspective, we are in the process of, so we're uniquely positioned in the sense that we don't directly represent people. We are representing coalitions of community-based organizations that serve people and work with people directly. I can still have touch points with those people who are being worked with, but it's not the same way where I'm engaging with the organizer on a regular basis. And so with that, we're kind of relying on telephone information if we're not getting that direct contact. And I think that policies should be driven by those who are directly impacted, like they're the experts in the solution. And so part of what we're looking to form is potentially an advisory council or some type of body that we are vetting our policy decisions through, and that is probably spearheading what we're doing. And like, we could be in the early stages of it. Does this work? What are the questions that we're missing? What research do we need to be doing? And things like that. So we're still figuring out what something like that being built into our organization could look like, because there are also challenges with having a singular committee structure, meaning that you're tapping out, you're tapping into certain voices. They're probably stretched. Like a lot of people that I work with are formerly incarcerated, but we consistently hear the same formerly incarcerated activists in different spaces. So what does it look like what does it mean to be having them be overexpended? And like, how are we making sure that we're compensating them for their time and that they're not supposed to just freely show up here? So there was still juggling a number of those things. And I think externally, I think that's why when we are working on like different campaigns, one of the campaigns I'm working with is advancing the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Ordinance. This would set up a civilian oversight body that is both two-tiered, so it will work within the particular police districts within Chicago. Within Chicago, we have about 22 of them. And then also we'll have a higher level commission that's overseeing the entire city and making sure that community and community leadership, community voices have a decisive role in how policy and public safety looks on the ground. And so with doing that kind of work, we're constantly having to call out public officials, be it you're having actual actions at their offices, their homes, typically the office though. What does that look like in COVID? So a virtual space. What are these actions? Are we're doing things on social media, bombarding, being intentional about our communications, having central talking points as we're going to different news outlets, and making sure that we are being very clear about how this issue should be classified. So it's it's also tying people both internally and externally, I'll keep saying this, to timelines, and making sure that there is a timeline. If I'm giving a demand of a public official, call this for a committee vote by X date. That if there is nothing attached to a timeline, then it's just something that floats in thin air, and then we don't have another checkpoint. So yeah, I think it's timelines, and for the committee, internally, making sure that there are people resources associated with it. So don't say that we have this issue or this idea, but you're not willing to allow people to allocate their time or give them additional compensation to make sure that this thing happens. Because we value where we put our money. So if we're not putting our money, if we're not putting our resources into it, then we can't say we value it.
I think that's a perfect place to stop, actually, and to give you all a few moments back of your day. I want to thank you all for joining us for this important discussion about various strategies and ways that we engage, involve, and help to expand the capacity of community work. Part of that is, as I've heard today, acknowledging your whole self, framing the right questions and solutions, being sure that we involve communities in various places of decision-making, and ensuring that we hold ourselves accountable, as well as the organizations that we work for and the communities that we are working with. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everyone that joined us for the last hour and hour plus. We really do appreciate it at the Institute. Join us next week for our 4th installment of our community conversations with Professor Rakaya Yerby. And we'll stop the recording there and the live portion of the webinar. Thank you all so much again.